Hello everyone, this is Mr. O'Brien. Welcome to the second 1850s presentation. By the end of this presentation, which covers the second half of the 1850s, the Civil War will have begun. So if you think back to the first presentation, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 really was the act that set this whole thing aboil. There are a few things to remember here. Number one, prior to this act, slavery had been banned from all territories that were in fact going to eventually become states. But since the act, it was now up in the air what was going to happen in those territories before they became states. So with popular sovereignty, this Kansas territory, this Nebraska territory, Utah territory, New Mexico territory, they were going to vote whether or not they were going to become slave states once they applied for statehood. So as each state approached enough population to apply for statehood, you had pro-slavery forces and anti-slavery forces flooding the state, attempting to sway the vote one way or the other. The first state where popular sovereignty was tested was Kansas. So dramatic events in 1855 and 1856 fueled the Republican Party's growth. As I said, pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces began flooding the state in a competition to generate numbers to sway the vote. So although pro-slavery Missourians, border ruffians, right, coming from the adjacent state to the east, Missouri, they were crossing the border to illegally vote in the election. They were encouraged to do this by the governor of Missouri. Remember, Missouri was a slave state. So you have these pro-slavery forces, these border ruffians, crossing the border to cast fraudulent ballots in Kansas elections in 1854 and 1855, the election that was to decide whether or not they were to become a slave or a free state. Now, obviously, pro-slavery forces won, and this President Pierce recognized the legitimacy of the resulting pro-slavery legislature and replaced the territorial governor a Northerner. Settlers from free states soon established their own rival government, and civil war erupted. For example, if you look up here in Lecompton, that became kind of like a headquarters for the abolitionist anti-slavery forces. Lawrence, Kansas. All these places were attacked by pro-slavery forces, and this civil war that erupts became known as Bleeding Kansas. Eventually 200 people die in Bleeding Kansas. So this conflict seemed to discredit Stephen Douglas's policy of popular sovereignty on the slave question. Now, in 1858, Kansas eventually rejects the pro-slavery constitution, and they are admitted to the Union as a free state. But let's not forget the border war that was now beginning between Missouri and Kansas. And let's not forget the Civil War, the Bleeding Kansas, if you will, that popular sovereignty had created. Now moving on, the crime against Kansas. So in response to Bleeding Kansas, Senator Charles Sumner from the new Republican Party had gotten up before the Senate and was waxing poetic about the travesty that was going on in Kansas, the violence by the pro-slavery forces, but the fact that at that time the pro-slavery government was the one being recognized. And what happened is, as Sumner relinquishes his position at the podium, South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks beats anti-slavery Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts unconscious with a cane after Sumner denounces this, quote, crime against Kansas. So this becomes a symbol of what the pro-slavery forces are willing to do to maintain their system. Now we get to John Brown. Was he a madman? Was he a hero? Was he a martyr? Now, Brown was a deeply religious man, and he had long been involved in anti-slavery activities. He was highly influenced by the Old Testament of the Bible. Now, Brown was reacting specifically to the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas by pro-slavery forces. The 1856 attack on Lawrence, Kansas. Again, this was during the summer known as Bleeding Kansas. This was the sacking of Lawrence was made by pro-slavery Southerners, and he, in response, murdered 5 pro-slavery settlers. This is known as the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. You will be doing much more about him in a voice thread assignment. So now we get to the 1856 presidential election, and this was won by James Buchanan, a Democrat. And if you look at the election results, again, you can see the sectionalism. James Buchanan, the Democrat, wins all of the South, a little bit in the North. John C. Fremont, the Republican, the new Republican Party, wins a very good portion of the North, but not enough for the presidency. So James Buchanan wins the 1856 election, the one preceding the election of Abraham Lincoln. Now we get to the Dred Scott versus Sandford Supreme Court case, 1857. This is perhaps the worst decision in American Supreme Court history. President James Buchanan, while he was a staunch defender of the Union, failed to settle the growing sectional tensions. He hoped that a Supreme Court case would finally resolve the slavery controversy. During the 1830s, Dred Scott, a Missouri slave, had accompanied his owner to both Illinois, where slavery was prohibited by the Northwest Ordinance and state law, and then to Wisconsin, where it was barred by the Missouri Compromise. After returning to Missouri, Scott sued for his freedom, arguing that residents on free soil had freed him, and in fact, it had worked in many other cases. He was not trying to set precedent. In fact, we remember this case because he lost. The Dred Scott decision was announced in March 1857, shortly after Buchanan was inaugurated. The court essentially was divided 6-3, with Chief Justice Roger B. Taney speaking for the majority. Taney declared that, 1, only white persons could be citizens of the United States, since the founders believed, to quote him, blacks had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Blacks, having different ancestors and lacking a heritage of freedom, could never join the nation's political family. So his decision was steeped in that Anglo-Saxonism that we've talked about. It was also arguing for a specific interpretation of Jefferson's Declaration. In other words, when Jefferson said all men are created equal, he meant something specific, white people, according to Roger Taney. Now, Taney and the court majority also ruled that, number 2, that Scott remained a slave. They ruled that Illinois state law had no effect on Scott once he returned to Missouri. So in other words, he rejected the once free, always free doctrine. You don't become free simply by going to a free state. You maintain your slavehood. And 3, he also argued that Congress had no constitutional power to bar slavery from a territory. And 4th, this effectively made the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. He basically said, not only is the once free, always free doctrine wrong, but that territory that you thought was free, in fact, really wasn't free, because that whole Missouri Compromise thing, it was unconstitutional, so it's like it never happened. So this effectively made the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, as was any law that interfered with Southerners' right to bring slave property into the territories. The decision effectively made unconstitutional the Republican platform for restricting slavery and undermined the policy of popular sovereignty. If Congress could not prohibit slavery in a territory, how could a territorial legislature created by Congress do so? In the North, the Dred Scott decision sank the reputation of the Supreme Court, which many now regarded as beholden to the slave power. President Buchanan declared that slavery would from then on be legal and constitutional in all Western territories. And in effect, it can be argued that this made slavery legal on a national level in the North. If a Southerner could just go up north and bring his or her slave, in what way is that not then legal slavery up north? It never came to that, but theoretically it could have.